Preface. Derrida's critique of Husserl is a first-class piece of analytical work in the philosophy of language. But since Derrida belongs to a philosophical tradition which is foreign, both geographically and intellectually, to most English-speaking philosophers, he is difficult to read. To see the power of his thought, it is necessary for us to see how the problems that he articulates and the comments that he makes fit within the framework of issues in the philosophy of language that are commonly considered in Britain and America, which is difficult to do without irreparably distorting his thoughts. Surely for this purpose it is wiser not to try a direct translation from Derrida's Heideggerian language into the more straightforward prose of American analytic philosophy, but rather to look for a wider framework in which both these schools can be seen and compared. Medieval thought can give us this wider perspective, if we take as our starting point its pedagogical division of the study of language into three parts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The medieval trivium is a much sounder approach to the study of language and gives a much more adequate framework for understanding the philosophy of language than its all too fashionable neglect might lead one to suppose. The three studies correspond nicely to three skills, or three sorts of competence, that we expect of a person who uses language. We expect, first, that a speaker, and mutatis muta and dis a hearer, will be able to put together the words of the language in acceptable phrases and will be able to modify those words as required by their position in the phrases. The details of this requirement are studied by grammarians, and though grammatical skill is superficial from LXX the point of view of philosophical problems, it is nonetheless a prerequisite for the other sorts of competence we expect of language users. We expect, second, that a language user will be able to recognize when an expression or a sequence of expressions is absurd or contradictory. The expressions which are recognized as absurd or contradictory will always be somehow complex, rather than simple, and it is in the combination of more simple expressions that this absurdity or contradiction lies. For example, the colorless green ball, the shapeless square box, and the alert response of the dead man are all noun phrases, but in each one of them there is a combination of more than one expression, and it is the combination of incombinables that makes these noun phrases absurd or illogical. In the case of sequences of expressions, such as the poet is a penguin, E. Cummings, or all the boys went on a hike, but two of them stayed in their rooms, where we have a predicative sentence or a conjunction of two sentences, it is obvious that more than one expression is involved. In a broad sense, logic studies both these sorts of absurdity and proceeds formally, presenting its rules in terms of THQ expressions themselves without reference to the time or place or circumstances of their use. We expect, third, that a speaker will know how and when to use the linguistic expressions whose grammar and logic he has mastered. We expect that he will know when it is appropriate, and when it is not, to describe his sensations, to offer a definition, to curse, to pray, to utter an imperative, and so on. Traditionally, rhetoric, ignoring the details of these common garden variety uses of language, has concentrated its attention on the more subtle features of public speech and of literature and on the classification of styles and tropes. In spite of the way that the tradition has restricted itself, it has included within its purview a discussion of the proper use of contradictory expressions, such as the logical absurdities that occur in metaphors, and has thereby implicitly claimed a kind of priority over logic. This implicit claim sets the stage for an important controversy that concerns us directly. But the traditional restriction of scope is bothersome, and it is more useful to think of rhetoric as the general study of the aptness and ineptness of the use of various expressions or sorts of expressions in various sorts of circumstances. Rhetoric is thus not a matter of pure form but has to do with the relation of language to the world, to life, through the relation of linguistic expressions to the specific circumstances in which their use makes sense. XL in these traditional terms, the central issue of philosophy of language, the issue around which all other issues revolve and to which they all return and in terms of which we can surely see the relation of Derrida to other philosophers, is the issue about the relation of logic and rhetoric. Grammar, having to do with the good order of signs and their relation to one another, is relatively superficial. Logic and rhetoric, on the other hand, both lead us into more profound areas because they both have to do with the use and interpretation of signs. The very fact that logic and rhetoric both have to do with the use and interpretation of signs leads us immediately into the all-important question of their relative priority. Can there be two independent foundations for our theory of meaning? Must there be two irreconcilable criteria for the use and interpretation of signs and hence for linguistic description? Or is one of these two seemingly fundamental disciplines in fact contained in or derivative from the other? When we are able to resolve his fundamental question about the relation of logic to rhetoric, we will then have established a solid vantage point from which to resolve the subsidiary questions about private language, about meaning, about form and use, about Sinn and Bedeutung, about Ausdruck and Entseigung, and about the temporal and the non-temporal aspects of discourse. In the history of Western philosophy, the philosophy of language including a great deal of its metaphysics has almost invariably been based on logic rather than rhetoric. This is certainly true of Plato's theory of forms, of Aristotle's doctrine of predication, of the medieval controversy over universals, of Leibniz' grand project for a universal symbolism, and of rationalism and idealism in general. It is also true, though less obviously so, of empiricist philosophy from Hobbes and Locke through to Brentano and James and Russell, for the empiricists have taken it for granted that the ideas represented by our linguistic signs already stand in logical relations to one another before we have signs to represent them. The exceptions that come to mind are on the fringe of the philosophical tradition rather than in its mainstream. Ibn Khaldun is one. As much a historian and sociologist as a philosopher, he regarded philosophy as frivolous. He characterized language as a technical habit, that is, a trait or talent having to do with some art or craft or technique and for him grammar and logic seemed to be refinements of rhetoric, in our broad sense of the term. 12 Condillac is another, with his view that language began with gestures and that verbal language has retained the essential features of this original language of action. Rousseau is perhaps the best known of these exceptions, much influenced by Condillac. He saw the origins, and hence the essence, of language in the rhythms and intonations of our passions rather than in the more logical realm of practical affairs. Reason enough for Derrida to devote a long section of his De la Grammatologie to a sympathetic account of Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages. But Rousseau's essay remained unpublished during his lifetime, and this typifies how we could challenge these alternative conceptions of language posed to the mainstream of philosophical tradition. 20th century philosophy has been dominated by considerations about the nature of language. It was only to be expected that there would be a flurry of activity as the nature and foundations of logic came to be closely investigated in the last part of the 19th century and the early part of our century, for the first time in more than 2,000 years. In fact, there have been two distinct flurries. The first movement was naturally a reinforcement of the philosophy of language based on logic, but the subsequent movement has been an overthrow of that long tradition, the overthrow which Derrida speaks of as the closure of metaphysics. In order to see the significance of Derrida's critique of Husserl, we must look more closely at these two movements. The end of the 19th century and the first few decades of the present century were a time of profound and far-reaching work on the nature of logic, the foundations of mathematics, and the relation of logic to mathematics. It was inevitable that the surge of new vitality in logical theory should have an impact on the philosophy of language, of one sort or another. On the one hand, it was urgent that the new concepts and theories should fit into a general conception of language, and on the other hand, a new burst of progress in logic seemed to promise an explanation of the nature of language. Already by the turn of the century it was apparent that the dominant theme was to be the increasing submission of philosophy in general, and of philosophy of language in particular, to the sovereignty of logic. This movement was due primarily to the work of five great men, Frege and Husserl in Germany, Whitehead and Russell in Engdertine and Wittgenstein, who straddled the gap that separates the continent from its most illustrious island. Though some allowance must be made for the later work of Husserl and Wittgenstein, all five of these powerful figures were logicians, all five associated the problems of logic in some way or other with the problems of mathematics, and the five of them together gave an irresistible impetus to the view that language is basically and primarily logical in character and that the fundamental essential features of language can be determined on the basis of requirements of logic. Since Derrida, through his critique of Husserl, is attacking the whole tradition in which language is conceived as founded on logic rather than on rhetoric, it is necessary to try to get a general picture of the common features of this philosophical tradition in spite of the obvious risk that such generalization will inevitably distort the views that are generalized and may even seem outrageous to some of us who have been brought up to regard the differences between empiricism and rationalism as more fundamental than their common adherence to a philosophy of language that uses logic rather than discourse as the ultimate criterion for meaning. What rationalists and empiricists disagree about is the origin of ideas. What they have in common is the view that signs represent ideas and that an idea is something that can stand in semantic contrast or contradiction to another idea and can be seen to stand in such contrast or contradiction without reference to contexts of communication, to voices resounding in the corridors, or to how they figure in the stream of life. This agreement about language being founded upon signs that represent ideas, which might be called the proximate source of language, has generally been considered less important than the disagreement between rationalism and empiricism about the ultimate source of language, the origin of the ideas that are to be represented by the signs. But it is precisely the common logical presuppositions, based on a common view that the primary purpose of language is epistemological, that need to be re-examined. Working within a Heideggerian framework, Derrida, like the later Wittgenstein, focuses attention on this common tradition in order to question its intelligibility and hence to challenge the cogency of both schools of philosophy that are based upon it. One important feature of the ideas that signs represent is that they are timeless, in the sense that they are not to be located and identified spatio-temporally. In this respect they differ from the acts of communication, the actual utterances, that occur in the course of our activities as language users. That signs represent timeless ideas has a number of direct consequences that set the problems that Derrida considers. The first of these is that since a sign, in at least one prominent sense of that term, is something with physical characteristics and occurs in spatio-temporal contexts, there must be a radical distinction, a distinction in kind, between signs and what they signify. In France this distinction is most commonly known through the work of Saussure as the distinction between signified and signify, signifier and signified. Derrida assumes familiarity with Saussure's terminology and its implications, and a key point in his attack on metaphysics in Chapter 4 is his attack on the requirement of a logical account of language that a sign be a completely different sort of thing from what it signifies and that the latter not be determined in any manner by the former. He may well seem to be overstating his point, since what he attacks is a distinction between signs and reality, which seems not to be so much a metaphysical distinction as one of the most down-to-earth common sense. But we should bear in mind that what is ultimately real, on the view that he is attacking, is some sort of ideas, or things that can stand in logical relations to one another, and this conception of the world as fundamentally logical is not a common sense view, nor does the common sense distinction between signs and reality in any way imply that there must be a concomitant metaphysical distinction between reality, thus metaphysically conceived, and signs. Indeed, if I have understood Derrida right, his insistence that there cannot be such a metaphysical distinction is both sound and profound. A second consequence of taking the timelessness of ideas as the foundation of language is that a certain amount of Platonism is inevitable, in that the actual is explained in terms of the ideal. Consider, for example, actual linguistic utterances where speakers mean something or other by uttering some linguistic expression at some specific time and place. How is the speaker's meaning, what he means at that time and place, to be explained? The thought that he is expressing that is, in Frege's terminology, the sense, sin, of the sentence he utters or, in Husserl's terminology, its meaning, Bedeutung, must be explicated by means of the ideas that are represented by the constituent words of that sentence. Derrida develops this issue 15 in his final chapter, where the dilemma that he poses for Husserl might be rephrased as the question, how can language, meaning, ever be used in reference to transient objects and circumstances, given that it is established and constituted independent of them? It is obvious that this question strikes at the very heart of Husserl's phenomenological account of language. Some idea of the way in which the issue arises in other versions of the logical view of language may be appreciated by comparing this question with one that Wittgenstein asked himself in the Tractatus, 5552. The experience that we need in order to understand logic is not that something or other is the state of things, but that something is, that, however, is not an experience. Logic is prior to every experience that something is so. It is prior to the question how, not prior to the question what. 55,521. And if this were not so, how could we apply logic? We might put it in this way, if there would be a logic even if there were no world, how then could there be a logic given that there is a world? 1/8 consequence, closely related to the second, is that there must be a radical distinction between what Frege called sense and reference, or between what Husserl called expression and indication. These distinctions are not exactly the same, but they have the same purpose, namely, to distinguish as two separate and independent domains the timeless, context-free, semantic relations of signs to one another and the time-dependent, contextually variant, semantic relations of signs to the world. It is now commonplace among British and American philosophers to suppose that the theory of meaning must be divided into at least two parts, a theory of sense and a theory of reference, though those who follow Charles Morris would divide it into three parts, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. The underlying assumption is that what linguistic expressions mean is one sort of question and that how and when they are to be applied is a separate and independent question. To the extent that this assumption is part and parcel of the logical conception 1. Ludwig Wittgenstein, Tractatus Logico-Theosophicus, trans. D. F. Pearce and B. F. McGinnis, New York, Humanities Press, 1961. 16 of the foundations of language, one challenges the underlying philosophy when one denies that these two domains of meaning can really be kept separate, as Derrida does throughout speech and phenomena and, in particular, in Chapter 7. The parallel is striking with the later work of Wittgenstein, in which such a denial is one of the first and most prominent themes. A fourth consequence of basing meaning on timeless ideas is that the analysis and resolution of the nest of issues involved is going to turn on one's conception of time and eternity. Involved in this is the underlying issue of the relation between the finite and the infinite, for the question whether time presupposes eternity or eternity presupposes time is a more specific form of the general question whether the infinite is to be conceived within the finite or the finite within the infinite. All of these questions sound like rather abstract metaphysical issues, unfamiliar as critical considerations within Anglo-American philosophy. Yet in Chapter 6 Derrida explicitly makes time the key to his analysis, or what he calls his deconstruction. This move will appear less baffling when one realizes that Derrida's deconstruction in terms of time is equivalent to analysis of the meaning of linguistic expressions in terms of their use or the role that they play in human activities. In both cases the point is to insist that the timeless can be understood only as an aspect of, or as an abstraction from, temporal occasions. A second feature of the philosophy of language based on logic is just as crucial but can be dealt with more briefly. It is the commitment to what Wittgenstein called a private language, or to some conception of private understanding or inner speech such that it is possible for linguistic expressions to have meaning for us in private mental life, quite independent of any reference to public objects or external circumstances. Such a commitment to private language or to private understanding cannot be renounced once the criterion for linguistic meaning has been set within the domain of logic. For logical truths and logical considerations are formal and do not vary according to circumstance, so their essence must be independent of any sets of circumstances. What is independent of circumstance in this way I cannot learn by example or by teaching, at any rate its essence cannot be given to me in any such manner. If I learn it at all, it must, so it would seem, be within a realm that lies entirely within me, in my private mental life. This kind of commit 17 ment is obvious throughout modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes and Locke, and shows itself with equal vigor and clarity at the turn of the century in the writings of Husserl and Russell. One of the remarkable and rewarding parts of Derrida's book is his forceful rejection, in Chapter 4, of the possibility of private understanding, an interesting parallel to the famous private language argument in Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, 243-315. The second movement in the 20th century philosophy of language has lacked the solid foundation that the first enjoyed. Unlike grammar and logic, rhetoric has not been refurbished by new ideas and new vigor but remains a weak and ancillary discipline about which few students of language have strong or clear ideas. As an academic subject, rhetoric remains associated with elocution and literary criticism rather than with linguistics and logic. The development of linguistics in the 20th century has tended to reinforce the association between meaning and logic rather than to challenge it. It did this from the very beginning in the hands of Saussure, who regarded the elements of language as something ideal rather than empirical and whose distinction between signifiant and signify we have already mentioned. The latest developments in linguistics continue the trend. Transformational grammar is based on a distinction between surface structure and deep structure, with deep structure being an idealized abstraction that either contains or interprets the semantic component of language. Behind the rather esoteric controversy in transformational linguistics between generative semantics and interpretive semantics there lies unexamined and almost unnoticed the assumption that linguistic meaning belongs to an abstract realm where logical criteria predominate. This assumption is not altogether unwelcome, since it leads to fruitful collaboration between linguists and logicians, but it does make it difficult to raise and press the fundamental questions in the philosophy of language, the ones that have to do with the ultimate foundation of linguistic meaning. In spite of the lack of a vigorous discipline of rhetoric, that is, of any hard-headed, detailed study of the rules and regularities and presuppositions of the use of linguistic expressions in the circumstances in which they actually are used, there have been philosophers who have emphasized this aspect of meaning, 18 either as one part of a semantic dualism or as a primary sense of meaning within which the logical aspects of meaning must find a specialized and restricted niche. In Britain and America semantic dualism undoubtedly rests most prominently on the work of Freya and his distinction between sense and reference. Within the framework of that general distinction or some variation on it, there have developed the ideas of operational definitions and coordinating definitions in science and of recursive definitions in mathematics. It is characteristic of these definitions that they do not really explain the meaning, Bedeutung in Husserl's sense, or the sense, Sinn in Freya's sense, of the expressions they are used to define but serve instead to present effective criteria for the use of those expressions. It seems obvious that definitions of this sort present rhetorical rather than logical considerations as governing the meaning of words and that this should raise the question whether operational definitions provide the proper form for all explanations of meaning. But if the question has ever been raised in this form, it has not had any significant historical impact. For the most part operational definitions were conceived within a sort of semantic dualism, and it was assumed that the characteristic problems of dualism in this case the logical aspects of words introduced only operationally would sort themselves out without trouble. Certainly the question of the relation of operational meaning to conceptual meaning raises far deeper and more profound questions than have yet been effectively answered. Philosophers who have given some impetus to the view that rhetoric rather than logic provides the foundation for linguistic meaning include Peirce and Royce in the 19th century and Wittgenstein and Austin in the post-war period. Peirce was undoubtedly one of the first to advocate operational definitions, but his more general philosophy of language is extremely difficult to interpret, largely because it is so difficult to know whether he would allow or encourage any priority among the various trichotomies that he sets down. Nonetheless, his emphasis on interpretation, as opposed to conception, suggests that meanings are to be explained ultimately in terms of the human context in which they are interpreted. If this is correct, Peirce would be the first philosopher who combined an emphasis upon operational definitions with the view that such operationally, or contextually, explained meaning is the primary source for all linguistic meaning. Certainly Royce interpreted Peirce this way and took his conception of meaning and interpretation as the crux for some important considerations in his social philosophy, especially in lectures 11 and 12 of The Problem of Christianity. Since 1940 in Britain, and moving from there to America, a considerable impetus to consider rhetoric rather than logic as the bedrock for language and for meaning has been given by the work of Wittgenstein and Austin. In the present context our attention must focus on Wittgenstein, since his own philosophical development, with respect to the foundations of language, is in many ways parallel to the movement in continental philosophy from Husserl to Heidegger and Derrida. Lest this emphasis should seem to slight Austin, it should be said explicitly that in another context, where the concern was for revitalizing the discussion of rhetoric and incorporating it as a rigorous part of general linguistics, Austin's method would receive primary emphasis. Austin's rather conventional effort at classification, so as to provide a way to count what Wittgenstein referred to as the countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences / and his patient attention to detail lend themselves much more readily to a scientific interest than does Wittgenstein's work, and something like Austin's theory of speech acts must be involved if rhetorical force is to be seen as the indispensable basis of linguistic meaning. But Wittgenstein provides a more useful framework for understanding the import, in Anglo-American terms, of Derrida's criticism of Husserl. It is obvious that Wittgenstein's Tractatus bears close affinities to Husserl's logical investigations. Not only does Wittgenstein's notion of a Begriffsschrift correspond closely with Husserl's conception of a rein logisch grammatisk Form and Lehre, as Max Black points out too, but the whole idea of the Tractatus seems to be to provide what Husserl called a pure logical grammar. Wittgenstein's aim, that is to show how it is possible for there to be language at all, by specifying the indispensable prerequisites for meaningful sentences, considered without reference to any of the accidental or empirical characteristics of those sentences. In this early work Wittgenstein, and here the hegemony of epistemology, of which Derrida complains, is apparent, allows only one sort of fully meaningful sentence, namely, those that describe the world. For there to be such sentences, there are two. Max Black, a companion to Wittgenstein's Tractatus *, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1964, p. 136. XX, apart from the contingent and empirical prerequisites of human existence, vocal organs, and so on, two a priori requirements. The first is an elaboration of a Kantian image, namely, that there must be a single logical space, since each sentence or proposition determines a point in logical space. In its generalized form, this requirement is the requirement that there must be a language if there are to be sentences, a view which persists in Wittgenstein's later work. The second requirement is that the sentences be composed of names that are correlated with non-contingent objects. Ultimately, logical space, the first requirement, is itself based upon this metaphysical foundation of simple and eternal objects. Here, then, is the crux of Wittgenstein's early theory of language, an invulnerable foundation, but one whose very invulnerability is its ultimate weakness. It is a metaphysical foundation which is determined and preserved by logical requirements and which in its turn preserves and determines logic. Section 107 of the Philosophical Investigations presents as clearly and poignantly as one could wish the trend of his later thinking about the foundation for the pure logical grammar of his earlier work. The more narrowly we examine actual language, the sharper becomes the conflict between it and our requirement. For the crystalline purity of logic was, of course, not a result of investigation, it was a requirement. The conflict becomes intolerable, the requirement is now in danger of becoming empty. We have got onto slippery ice, where there is no friction, and so in a certain sense the conditions are ideal, but also, just because of that, we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction. Back to the rough ground. 3. When Wittgenstein turned from making demands to making observations, for his later philosophy is based firmly on the conviction that a philosopher has to look and see what happens and that he can only describe and in no way impose requirements. What he saw was that linguistic expressions are everywhere embedded in contexts of human activity. In order to conclude that they are in fact intrinsically and inextricably embedded in such activity, he had to present two sorts of consideration. 1-3. Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, trans. G.E.M. Anscombe, New York, Macmillan, 1963. XXI to break down the seeming necessity for metaphysical foundations, by showing that the metaphysical demands and hypotheses are ultimately incoherent, and the other to show how both the familiar and the problematic features of language and language use can be accounted for within a theory of language which takes rhetorical force rather than word meaning as the foundation for language. It is very easy to overemphasize the importance of Wittgenstein's rejection of his earlier position, since such an overemphasis quickly leads us to overlook the remaining similarities. But there is nonetheless a strong negative component in Wittgenstein's presentation of his new position, a component consisting of at least four sorts of argument, against the primacy of names, against the possibility, or even the conceivability, of objects that are absolutely or metaphysically simple, against both the coherence and cogency of the demand for absolute exactness, which Freya had earlier persuaded him was essential if there is to be any conceptual meaning at all, and against the possibility of private language or private understandings or private meanings, such as seems to be presupposed by any theory which begins by associating words with ideas or by taking names to be signs for ideas in the mind of the person that uses them. These negative arguments of Wittgenstein's against his former views, and against other philosophies which take logic as constituting the essence of language, are set firmly in an alternative constructive conception of language according to which the meaning of linguistic expressions is based ultimately on their rhetorical force, that is, on the role that they play in human activities. The central notions in terms of which Wittgenstein elaborates this new view of language are those of language games, of rules and practices, and of forms of life. To understand a linguistic expression, one must know the game being played with it, which in turn often depends largely, never wholly, on knowing the carried rules of the game and always depends in part on being able, knowing how, to follow the rules. Being able to follow rules depends, in turn, on practice or training, on being initiated into a form of life which is what is ultimately given as the basis of language. Thus language and logic, which are ideal, are founded on training, which is empirical, a result which seems to abolish logic, but does not do so. The reliance of this view on rhetorical force as the epitome of meaning, as well XXII as its relevance to the dispute between Husserl and Derrida, comes out most forcefully in a slogan reported by Norman Malcolm, only in the stream of life does an expression have meaning. Derrida's position is markedly similar. Derrida falls squarely within the movement which regards the role of utterances in actual discourse as the essence of language and meaning, and which therefore regards logic as derivative from rhetorical considerations. His penetrating consideration and ultimate rejection of the basic principles of Husserl's philosophy of language is the historical analogue of Wittgenstein's later consideration and rejection of his own earlier work, the Tractatus Logica Philosophicus. In both cases a work belonging to the first historical movement in the philosophy of language of the 20th century is examined and found unintelligible, at least partly on its own terms, and the alternative to the rejected theory is one that belongs to the second movement, according to which rhetoric and the context of actual communication are an essential and ineradicable feature of all linguistic meaning. As we consider Derrida's criticism of Husserl, we should bear in mind that Derrida does not simply overthrow Husserl any more than Wittgenstein's later work simply overthrew his earlier work. In both cases the later work depends heavily upon the earlier, and with respect to other issues than those upon which we are focusing here, the common elements probably overshadow the differences. In its negative component, the core of Derrida's analysis, or deconstruction, is a sustained argument against the possibility of anything pure and simple which can serve as the foundation for the meaning of signs. It is an argument which strikes at the very idea of a transcendental phenomenology. The move is parallel with Wittgenstein's rejection of the idea of simples, which is also the core of the negative component in his later work, but whereas the simples that Wittgenstein came to reject were logical atoms, or objects free from any contingent or empirical properties, the simples that Derrida rejects are the simples of transcendental phenomenology rather than of logical atomism, viz., experience that is pure in the sense that it can be fully understood as it is found in our private mental life, without reference to transient circumstances or actual empirical objects. These pure expert XXIIInstances must be some sort of direct and unmediated awareness of the present moment and its content. Therefore, a central aspect of Derrida's argument, in the next to the last chapter, lies in his examination of the claim that we can intelligibly think about and talk about present moments that are pure and simple, even though the present moments of Husserl's phenomenological account of meaning are not so pure and simple as, say, Hume's impressions, since their content includes retentions and protensions that have implications about the past and future. Here we have an example of Husserl being followed out and used against himself, just as Husserl criticized the British empiricists for sneaking in metaphysical commitments with the assumption that experience can be purely passive and free from implications about the past and future. Derrida makes an analogous objection to Husserl's own claim that there can be experience whose Ausdruck is, in essence, independent of its Ansiegen and which can therefore be fully comprehended in one's private mental life without presupposing the actual world and transient circumstances. In chapter 7 he elaborates another aspect of the argument, which culminates in the startling remark, there never has been any perception. This is, of course, not a rejection of any familiar everyday experience, but a rejection of a concept that is an idealized and, one might say, logicized abstraction from our common everyday experience. It is the concept of perception, not as the awareness of circumstances in which we live and move and have our being, but rather as the pure immediate awareness of a sensory content which, although complicated by retentions and protensions, has no intrinsic reference to any such actual circumstances. That such a concept of perception is not original with Husserl but has been an integral part of the empiricist tradition since Locke, and in modern times can be found as well in Russell, makes Derrida's point all the more important. It should be noted, too, that this aspect of Derrida's central argument is an echo of Wittgenstein's extended and fascinating discussion in 11 of Part 2 of his philosophical investigations, of seeing and seeing as. In both Wittgenstein and Derrida the remarks about perception are as difficult as they are important, and as puzzling as they are intriguing, but it can at least be said that both impugn the idea of pure perception and that what they have to say about perception goes hand in glove with rejection of the idea that the XXIV nature and essence of what is signified, le signify, is wholly independent of the nature of the sign that signifies it, le signifiant. Finally, there is an aspect of Derrida's attack upon the possibility of simples that seems to me to be original with him and to be highly interesting. It centers around his concept of difference. Difference, without which no language or meaningful sign can be conceived, is associated very closely in Derrida's work with what makes it possible to transcribe spoken language in writing. What makes writing possible is nothing having to do with the meaning of the spoken signs, what makes it possible is rather the pattern of vocalizations, the phonemics of the language. If I have understood Derrida right, one might say, though Derrida does not himself say it, that voix and écriture are ultimately in harmony rather than opposition because difference is essential to both. This may seem a perversely prosaic way to reduce the rich variety of remarks Derrida makes in his essay Difference, so a word of explanation is in order. Difference is a complex essential characteristic of signs, being composed of a, an actual difference which makes the sign possible, but which can be instituted and understood only in terms of b, other times and circumstances in which the instituted difference systematically appears. Such a characteristic, which Derrida, it must be remembered, regards as somewhat puzzling and problematic, is no doubt essential at each level of language. It is what makes possible both meaning in the strict sense and also linguistic significance in general. Although it is a general characteristic of signs, its most fundamental application is at the phonological level, since spoken sound, voix, actual speech in actual circumstances, is the indispensable basis for all linguistic signification. In the sound system of a language, according to structuralist phonology, the sounds that are ultimately differentiated linguistically are phonemes. Derrida's remarks imply that phonemic difference is a matter of difference rather than either actual acoustic difference as such or ideal difference as such. Both the above features are, essentially and indissolubly, involved in the differentiation of phonemes. Phonemes are, therefore, units or aspects of difference at the phonological level. As such they can be neither spoken nor written, but they are, and so is difference, if it is a viable concept, what makes it possible for sounds to be intelligible as voix and for marks to be intelligible as écriture. By following these notions back to their roots, Derrida shows that, XXV although speech and writing seem to be opposed to each other, they cannot ultimately be so, since what is essential to the one necessarily makes the other possible. Point 4 By taking difference, or the phonemic structure of the sound system of the language, as essential to any language or sign system, Derrida not only associates his central argument with a prominent element of contemporary linguistics but also strikes at the roots of the speculation about ideography that has often been associated with the logical conception of language as, for example, in Descartes' letter to Mersenne of November 20, 1629, or Leibniz' project for a characteristica universalis, or the comments about a Begriffsschrift that are to be found in the writings of Freya and Wittgenstein. Derrida's emphasis on difference being essential to any sign tells against any absolutely pure and simple signs, since the possibility of being transcribed in a writ for. While there can be no question of the originality of Derrida's formulation and his use of the concept of difference, there is an interesting historical precedent for some of the main points in Aristotle. Like Derrida, Aristotle bases his theory of meaning on spoken language, but what is spoken becomes language only if it can also be written down. Consider the following passage from the second chapter of the De Interpretations. A name is a spoken sound significant by convention, without time, none of whose parts is significant in separation. I say asterisk by convention because no name is a name naturally but only when it has become a symbol. Even inarticulate agrammatoi noises, of beasts, for instance, do indeed reveal something, yet none of them is a name. I6AI9-28, trans. J. L. Ackrell Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1963. Here the key concept is that of being articulated, that is, composed of segments or parts, for which Aristotle here uses the words grammata, elsewhere stoichia, and grammatoi. Now grammata are normally thought of as letters, but since a sound cannot literally have letters, they must be thought of here as phonemes, that is, as the parts of a sound that can be represented by letters. The natural cries of animals do signify something, they are signs, but they are not symbols, and we know they are not conventional, because they are not composed of articulate parts and cannot faithfully be transcribed in writing. So Aristotle held that what characterizes human speech and distinguishes it from natural cries is the possibility of writing, écriture, and the internal segmentation or differentiation of even the simplest semantic elements, difference. For further discussion of this passage, see N. Kretzmann, Aristotle on Sounds Significant by Convention, forthcoming from Recital Publishing Company, George Recht, in J. Corcoran, ed. Modernist Interpretations of Ancient Logic. XXVIing system, which necessarily involves a reference both to other times and to a system, is not anything that is intrinsic to the physical presentation of the sign, and it tells against metaphysical symbols when combined with his view that things cannot be conceived apart from the signs that represent them. If there is a parallel to this argument of Derrida's in the work of Wittgenstein, it would be found in Wittgenstein's insistence, in both his early and his later work, that a linguistic sign is always part of a system, but even if we were to regard these 2 points as significant analogues of each other, Derrida would deserve recognition for the power and force and originality of his formulation of the argument. I have already mentioned the attack on private language, and I would hope that philosophers in the analytic tradition would be able to find other familiar points presented in an exciting manner in Derrida's work. Nevertheless, I would not expect them to read the present work without frequent discomfort and occasional dismay. There are 2 aspects of the present work that contribute to such discomfort. One is Derrida's style. The work is full of metaphors, of plays upon words that often do not survive the translation, of florid language that sometimes leaves one mystified as to Derrida's intent, and of verbal contradictions or absurdities. Students of Wittgenstein are already familiar with the problem of having to read through someone's language in order to see the point lying behind it, presented obliquely but unstated and perhaps even unstatable, in some sense which can be and needs to be stated, since both Wittgenstein and Derrida believe there is something ultimately incoherent about the notion of a philosophical thesis. We cannot complain just because Derrida is often obscure, for the problems are exceedingly difficult, and a demand for pedestrian prose would be misplaced. But clarity is more than just pedestrian. Faced with Derrida's unrestrained literary extravagance, one cannot help wondering if the heavy reliance upon metaphor and paradox is not also misplaced. It is often difficult to be sure that there is consistency or even intelligibility lying behind Derrida's manner of expression. I have in mind those passages where Derrida has been willing to risk equivocation for the sake of a pun or to pay the price of apparent absurdity in order to achieve a striking turn of phrase, as when he says that there never has been any perception, that XXVII speech, voix, without deference would be at the same time absolutely dead and absolutely alive, in regard to Husserl's essential distinctions, that their possibility is their impossibility, that the verb diff and rare seems to differ from itself, that la diff f6 rans infini est fini, that the history of philosophy is closed, which, literally, is very like a child's claiming to be asleep, and so on. One cannot help wondering if the price is worth paying, and on at least one occasion in the last chapter Derrida himself is led into clearly fallacious reasoning that derives from his equivocation on finite and infinite. But most of these locutions can be explained as intelligible comments, and the philosophical insight lying behind them is often profound. One might well bear in mind, through one's exasperation with Derrida's literary flourishes, that his obliqueness is caused at least in part by a virtue he shares with Socrates and Russell and other great philosophers, viz., the ability to retain a sense of how very perplexing the most familiar phenomena are and to expose the weaknesses in a proposed solution by articulating it in detail so that its presuppositions are laid bare. The other worrisome aspect of the present work is the uncertainty about how Derrida views logic, knowledge, and philosophy. Just as the problem of reference is the one which presents the greatest challenge to the traditional logical conception of language, so the problem of logic is the greatest challenge to the conception of language that is found in Derrida and in the later work of Wittgenstein. Derrida gives us few hints, if any, as to how he will deal with this problem. In this respect there is a sharp contrast between Derrida and Wittgenstein, especially when we remember that in its wider implications the problem about logic includes the question whether we can ever really know anything, for in spite of his vigorous rejection of formalism, Wittgenstein never doubts the possibility of veridical knowledge and sound inference. One hopes that Derrida, having helped to shatter the reign of epistemology over our conception of language and metaphysics, will one day return to this problem. Part of this problem is a much more specific question, a question about the tools of his trade, about what standpoint he takes from which to criticize Husserl. Derrida announces the end of metaphysics, the closure of the history of philosophy. But just as Derrida raises the question whether Husserl succeeded in eliminating all presuppositions from his phenomenological inquiry, so readers are bound to ask whether Derrida has succeeded XXVII in eliminating all metaphysical presuppositions from his deconstruction. The question arises most forcefully when Derrida is discussing what is real and what is unreal, a question which it hardly seems possible to deal with without having a conception of reality in one's mind. It arises again when he insists that language depends on a relation to ma mort, a claim which it is difficult to conceive as other than metaphysical. No doubt the answer to this question will depend in part on epistemological views as well. Derrida seems at times to embrace a nominalism combined with a sort of radical empiricism. What is real seems to be the concrete reality immediately before me, and not aspects of what I see and experience that refer to other times or possibilities. Thus, as Lionel Abel has pointed out, Derrida's discussion of difference is reminiscent of Nelson Goodman's discussion of likeness of meaning, in that the likeness or identity of meanings or phenomena is something ideal and hence unreal, standing in sharp contrast to the reality of differences. This primacy of difference over identity is an eerie departure from common sense and is bound to be worrisome to Anglo-American readers. No doubt it stems in part from the analytical methods of structural linguists such as Sapir and Bloomfield, but such a genesis in structuralism can hardly be reassuring to those of us who remember Bloomfield's close association with logical positivism and who regard his linguistic methodological strictures as unduly severe. The worry is that Derrida may not have left himself any ground on which to stand and may be enticing us along a path to nowhere, a worry, by the way, which some philosophers have, mistakenly, I think, when they read Wittgenstein. It may be that these worries about Derrida's standpoint are unnecessary and that it is sufficient to note that his deconstruction, analysis, constantly harks back to the context of communication in which one person confronts another. Seen in this light, the central point of the book may well be that memorable sentence in the last chapter, "Tu restes alors à parler, à faire résonner la voix dans les couloirs pour supplier T6 clat de la présence." It remains, then, for us to speak, to make our voices resonate throughout the corridors in order to make up for the breakup of presence, though the last phrase is characteristically ambiguous and might also be rendered in order to supplement the 5. Lionel Abel, Important Nonsense, New York, Basic Books, 1 to the power of 72nd. XXIX Impact of One's Presence. In the history of recent philosophy this remark can well be taken as an answer to Wittgenstein's equally memorable epigram at the end of the Tractatus, "Wo von man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen," what we cannot speak about we must consign to silence. If these two slogans do not explicitly contradict each other, they at least present in dramatic form alternative conceptions of what is important, and readers will be well rewarded by taking the time to become acquainted with Derrida's view. Newton Garver State University of New York at Buffalo, June, 1972. Translator's introduction. The present work comprises a collection of 3 texts, Speech and Phenomena, which first appeared in 1967, together with 2 shorter pieces, Form and Meaning, 1967, and Difference, 1968. They were selected to appear together in translation with two reasons in mind. First, they present the English-speaking audience with a new generation of phenomenological criticism, indeed with one of the most thorough and reflective criticisms yet to appear on the work of Husserl. Second, they introduce the thought of Derrida himself to a new public, a thought that marks a considerable departure from the kind of exegesis and commentary that is all too present in current philosophical literature. It is not Derrida's intention, however, to remain confined within a particular framework of phenomenology. Rather, he sees it as his task to confront phenomenology with the tradition it has so often renounced up until now, the tradition of Western metaphysics itself. In choosing to begin with a critique of the logical investigations, Derrida has selected perhaps the most important, if not the most influential, of Husserl's writings on language. Derrida's interpretation is instructive in that he demonstrates how the whole of phenomenology is implied in a reflection upon language, how a discussion of meaning, expression, grammar, and logic, the themes of the investigations, will anticipate and later decide the forthcoming transcendental problems. The value of focusing the analysis here lies in the fact that Husserl begins the investigations with a set of essential distinctions, a group of operative concepts, that will rigorously and systematically guide his thought to the end. Derrida stresses the importance of these distinctions, not only because they dictate the course and structural unity of Husserl's own work, but because they repeat, in an explicit and cogent way, the very axioms of traditional metaphysics. This is only one stage of the argument, however, for he does not mean to portray Husserl and phenomenology as merely another example in the history of metaphysics. Derrida will argue even more emphatically that Husserl's thought is precisely the paradigm, the highest and final case of this tradition. And it is ultimately the claims and pretensions of this tradition, the parameters of which are admittedly vast, that Derrida wants to contest. Derrida asserts that throughout his writings Husserl continually invokes the most traditional concepts of Western metaphysics to serve as the axiomatic foundation for phenomenology, and this is evident from the first essential distinction. By this procedure a certain decision is taken to interpret the sense of being in a particular way. For Husserl and the tradition, the sense of being has always been interpreted as presence, and this interpretation assumes two forms: something is insofar as it presents itself or is capable of presenting itself to a subject as the present object, objectum, of a sensible intuition or as an objectivity presented to thought. Second, we say that a subject, subjectum, or self in general is only insofar as it is self-present, present to itself in the immediacy of a conscious act. The former marks the interpretation of being as objectivity, ousia, physis, etc., the latter as subjectivity, parousia, nous, etc. The interpretation of being as presence and self-presence entails a series of philosophical consequences and conceptual oppositions that persist to the present day, and nowhere are these consequences more strikingly evident than in the thought of Husserl. As part of his critical project of deconstruction, Derrida discusses the term deconstruction, while perhaps unusual, should present no difficulties here. It signifies a project of critical thought whose task is to locate and take apart those concepts which serve as the axioms or rules for a period of thought, those concepts which command the unfolding of an entire epoch of metaphysics. Deconstruction is somewhat less negative than the Heideggerian or Nietzschean terms destruction or reversal. It suggests that certain foundational concepts of metaphysics will never be entirely eliminated, even if their importance may seem to be effectively diminished. There is no simple overcoming of metaphysics or the language of metaphysics. Derrida recognizes, nonetheless, that the system of Western thought is finite. It has a finite number of translators. Introduction/XXXII genesis and derivation of the series as it functions in phenomenology. Among the many conceptual oppositions to be found here are those of matter, Heil, and form, eidos, idea, corporeal and incorporeal, body and soul, animate and inanimate, signifier and signified. Far from being presuppositionless, therefore, the interpretation of being as presence will provide phenomenology with its axial concepts. The highest principle of phenomenology, apodictic evidence, is precisely a call for the presentation or bringing forth, evadir, of objects to an immediate and self-present intuition. The notion of transcendental consciousness, as well, is nothing more than the immediate self-presence of this waking life, the realm of what is primordially my own. By contrast, the concepts of empirical, worldly, corporeal, etc., are precisely what stands opposed to this realm of self-present ownness. They constitute the sphere of otherness, the mediated, what is different from self-present conscious life, etc. All these concepts find their systematic unity in Husserl's account of language. Language, for Husserl, serves scientific thought and finds its model in the highest degree of scientific objectivity, the form of logical predication. And, we should not forget, it is across and through language that meaningful statements can be recorded and transmitted, that a body of doctrine can be set down and verified, that a community of scientists can communicate, that science itself becomes possible. Meaningful language, consequently, has its own rules and purpose. It is a pure logical grammar, and it expresses meanings in predicative form, i.e., in the form of a possible reference to an object. This is where Husserl makes the first essential distinction of the investigations. In language, there are two different sorts of signification, indication and expression. For Husserl, however, only one of these expresses axioms and a finite number of permutations that will continue to work themselves out in a given period of time as particular moments within this tradition, example as particular schools or movements of philosophy. In this sense, Derrida also speaks of the completion one of metaphysics, the terminal point of closure, Kultur, for the system. But the work of deconstruction does not consist in simply pointing out the structural limits of metaphysics. Rather, in breaking down and disassembling the ground of this tradition, its task is both to exhibit the source of paradox and contradiction within the system, within the very axioms themselves, and to set forth the possibilities for a new kind of meditation, one no longer founded on the metaphysics of presence. 14 Zion is meaningful. Expression alone, properly speaking, bears sense. It is important to understand why Derrida seizes upon this distinction. Meaningful language is limited to expression. But how does expression differ from indication? Husserl understands indication to be a movement of empirical association. One sensible sign stands for something else, a mark, a note, an object makes us pass from something present to thought to something that is only anticipated or expected. There is no meaning content present in indication, there is only an empty signifier and nothing that is signified. That is yet to come, it is yet to be presented. An expression, however, carries a meaning content with it. Meaning is present as the signified content of expression. What is immediately at stake in this linguistic distinction, then, is Husserl's entire account of meaning. What is perhaps more remote, but what for Husserl will ensure the very possibility of meaningful language, is its foundation upon an interpretation of being as presence. Derrida argues not only that this account of language and meaning is impossible but that it is essentially contradictory, given the conceptual framework of the metaphysics of presence. Rather than by pursuing this extremely complex argumentation in detail here, the purpose of such a general introduction would perhaps be better served by pointing out the directions it takes. For Husserl, the meaning content of expression is ideal, and expression is composed of an explicit willed meaning intention that animates a nonsensible signifier, for example, the thought or imagined word, the mere form of the actually uttered or written sign. In animating this purely formal signifier, the sign becomes invested with meaning, and meaning, Bedeutung, is ultimately the content of an interpretation, Deutung. The sign or signifier in general is always a sign for something. Now, for Husserl, all these elements of expression are non-real because they all take place within the immediacy of a self-present consciousness, what in the investigations he calls the sphere of solitary mental life and what he will later call transcendental consciousness. The difficulty in such a conception, and Husserl realizes this, is that actual communication always involves an abandonment of this privileged sphere. It involves the going out into a world, into a realm of empirical fact. For this reason he maintains that expression is necessarily interwoven with indication in every case of effective communication. Husserl must preserve the distranslator's introduction /xxxv distinction between the two kinds of sign, however, if he is to retain the ideal status of meaning, the possibility of a purely present and complete meaning. The original distinction is possible, in turn, only if expression itself can effectively take place within the purity of solitary mental life. Communication, then, would be a representation of what primordially occurs in this inner sphere. What is meant in communication is merely indicated by means of sensible signs, by the actually spoken or written signs. The problem here lies in the relation between expression and indication. What is the nature of this interweaving? If there is to be pure expression at all and, consequently, pure meaning, it must take place wholly within the internal sphere. In the absence of indication, it would be a silent monologue. There could be no meaningful communication per se in such a case, and, following Husserl's account, communication would come at the expense of meaning. But if indication were not merely interwoven with expression, if it were shown to be absolutely necessary to the very concept of expression, then the possibility of their distinction becomes suspect. And it is just this distinction that Derrida contests, together with the terms it rests upon, i.e., the solitary mental life and the purely ideal, self-present meaning. Derrida first devotes a long critique to Husserl's account of ideality. He insists that an ideal meaning is never a pure presentation to begin with, rather, it is itself a representation. Husserl uses the term Vorstellung, to consciousness, it is a product that is constituted across a series of discrete acts. What constitutes the ideality of meaning for Husserl is the possibility of its being repeated an infinite number of times. Clearly, this is never completed, its completion would demand our disappearance as finite beings. In any event, the ideal involves a relation of identity between acts, between a present act and an act that lies outside present consciousness. Moreover, the very form of the signifier, the sensory contour of a word or sign, is itself a constituted historical product. The signifier is neither accidental nor idiomatic, it always reflects a definite origin and heritage. In addition, each occasion of its use represents, representation, only one instance of its many possible uses, each use selectively repeats a pre-existent convention. And what is it, finally, that really happens in this interior monologue, in this expression of solitary mental life? The expression is not a communication, for there is nothing to communicate, meaning is immediately self-present to the XXX6 subject, so there is no need to communicate. What kind of expression is this, if there is no need to communicate anything to anyone? Husserl says this pure expression takes place entirely in the imagination. The interior monologue, then, is a fantasy representation, Fantasievorstellung, Verständigung. But for Husserl, the imagination can never be purely neutral, it is always the modification of an antecedent experience, and its aesthetic character always testifies to an origin in empirical reality. No matter how it is modified, reality becomes represented in the imagination. The imagination, then, and consequently the expressive monologue, is fraught with all those elements Husserl sought to exclude from it, all those empirical references which enter in under the various headings of repetition and representation. From the very start, language must be just this, a structure of repetition and representation. There can be no refuge from empirical determination in such a structure. Two consequences follow for Husserl: there can be no purely ideal meaning, no pure presence of ideality, for at every moment ideality would have to depend on precisely what is non-present, what is only repeated and represented in another presence. There can be no such sphere of pure self-presence either, for, in the simplest act of signifying, solitary mental life would be fractured by all that lies outside it, namely, the world. Once this occurs, the distinction between indication and expression can no longer be maintained. There is no presence or self-presence for signification, there is only an endless series of reverberations. What presents itself is the representation of non-presence, what Derrida calls otherness, difference, or aldehyde. The distinction between indication and expression seems to be of questionable worth, therefore, once the important function of representation and repetition is made clear. But in carrying out the critical task of deconstruction, Derrida shows how Husserl's whole theory of language is undermined by a still more fundamental problem, one that leads back to the phenomenological form of experience itself, the problem of time. Husserl claimed there was no need for communication in the interior monologue because, among other reasons, it took place in an instant, in the blink of an eye. Following this account, meaning would be immediately present in the self-same moment. There would be no need to mediate its presentation by means of signs. There would be no temporal distension in this process because signifier and signified are united in a punctual now. Translator's introduction /xxxvii. By Husserl's own premises, however, such an argument must fail. His theory of time dictates against any punctually isolated moment, for time is a phasing, a continual movement of protensional and retensional traces. In the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, Husserl argues that the present necessarily includes the phases of past and future under the heading of protension and retention. This conception of time denies the possibility of a temporally isolated moment or instant. The very presence of the present is conditioned by what is absent or not yet realized. Far from being the point of origin for constitution, the present is itself constituted, produced, and derived from a more primordial source of non-presence. Again, we find no arch S of presence or self-presence. What we do find is a groundless play of differences that reflects an outside and beyond of past and future. Derrida invokes the later account of temporality, not merely to play upon an inconsistency within Husserl's own thought, but rather to exhibit something far more important. In the logical investigations and elsewhere, the very concept of life had been understood as immediate self-presence, as the living presence of self-conscious thought. The historical importance of this concept cannot be overstated. It is what characterizes the modern thought of subjectivity since Descartes. Husserl, however, became increasingly skeptical of this view, as can be seen in his arguments against Brentano in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, against Hume in Erste Philosophic, and all throughout his later works, up to and including The Origin of Geometry. He came to see that, if the present now were conceived as a punctual instant, there could be no coherent account of experience as such. One would paradoxically end in denying the identity of one's own experience, one's own self, as did Hume. There could be no self-relation in such a case. In short, there could be no life, understood as absolute subjectivity. Derrida concludes that the whole problem and history of language must be entirely rethought. Instead of trying to capture and retain a pure presence, we must conceive signification from the start as a movement away from self-presence, a movement away from the pure presence of a discrete origin and the ideal presence of an identical meaning content. As a movement of difference, signification precedes and gives rise to the very concepts of self, presence, and meaning. The proper account of signification begins, not with the present and fulfilled meaning content, but with XXX6U, the sense that remains to be assembled and built up across the itinerary of convention and practice. Following Saussure, Derrida maintains that linguistic meaning is not so much the product of an explicit meaning intention as it is the arbitrary configuration of differences between signs. Meaning derives from the distance that extends between one particular sign and the system of other signs in linguistic use. It is this differential character of signs which must first be reckoned with, and this results from conventions existing within language. It is not a matter of meaning intentions that supervene from without. There is no meaning, no signified content, that stands above and is free from this play of differences. Point 2. Nor could meaning withstand the continuous shifting of differences, the continuous sedimenting of traces, as some ideal identity. For Derrida, there is only a likeness or sameness to meaning, which is constituted across the history of ever-changing usage. Absolute objectivity, therefore, could never be claimed for meaning, yet for Husserl, the highest degree of objectivity is that of absolute ideality, the perfect identity of an omnitemporal meaning. What is striking in Derrida's claim is the objection that linguistic meaning can never be completely present. There can never be an absolutely signified content, an absolutely identical or univocal meaning in language. All these values are denied to meaning once we admit its dependence upon non-present elements. Meaning can never be isolated or held in abstraction from its context, example its linguistic, semiotic, or historical context. Each such context, for example, is a system of reference, a system of signifiers whose function and reality point beyond the present. What is signified in the present, then, necessarily includes the differentiating and non-present system of signifiers in its very meaning. We can only assemble and recall the traces of what went before. We stand within language, not outside it. Starting out with the metaphor of presence, philosophy has generated a system of concepts whose import can be seen as essentially theological, what Heidegger has called the tradition of ontotheology. Ontology and theology are united in there too. Derrida will discuss the concept of difference as it relates to the areas of semiotics, semantics, epistemology, and ontology, among others. Each of these uses finds its origin in the more primordial movement of difference, with an A. For an explanation of this term, see below, footnote 8, p. 82. 3. For an account of this, see, especially, Martin Heidegger, Die Translator's Introduction / their 6 insistence upon a common ground and universal account of being, a first cause and final reason to things. For the tradition of Western metaphysics, this unity has always been asserted under the title of an absolute and non-empirical reality, a transcendent being or principle that would subtend the empirical order by virtue of its role as cause and form, arche, or telos. What invests the world with order and substance is ultimately something transcendent to that order, the divine, the one, the principle of intelligibility, the unconditioned. Now it is precisely this kind of theological status that the concept of meaning interpreted as ideality or absolute identity has enjoyed in the history of Western thought, and particularly when the account turns to problems of knowledge and signification. Despite the impurity of language and communication, the possibility of an ideal and identical meaning has always been held out, whether as pure form *, eidos idea, ideal, or as absolute referent in the form of an ideal content of signification, what Derrida elsewhere calls a transcendental signified. For thus, for Husserl, that is impure in language is only the adjunction of the sensory or so to speak bodily aspect, i.e., the factually uttered phrase, the actually written word. Complex. The purity of language, the very possibility of meaningful language, lies outside this sphere in the non-empirical or ideal sphere of meaning, in what can be purely meant or intended by language, in what can be expressed by language. Point 6. But Derrida's ontotheologist Preface under Metaphysik, in Identitat und Differenz, Fulingen, Nesk, 1957, English translation by Joan Stambaugh, Identity and Difference, New York, Harper and Row, 1969, pages 42 to 76. 4. Cf. Jacques Derrida, S6 Myology et Grammatology, Information sur les sciences sociales, 7, No. 3, June, 1968, especially 136 to 40. Also, Jacques Derrida, De la Grammatologie, Paris, Editions de Minude, 1967, especially pages 106 to 8. 5. In order to protect the pure presence of both solitary mental life and the signified meaning, a medium of signification is required that would be free from all empirical resistance, a signifying element is needed that would be absolutely non-empirical. For Husserl, this medium or element is the voice, and however silent it may be, the internal monologue is still spoken. The voice is the most ideal of signifiers in that it appears to be completely free of any empirical substance. Only in speech does the signifier seem to be completely reduced to its signified content. The spoken word is a strangely diaphanous and transparent medium for meaning. Because it animates a purely formal signifier, the sensory contour of the XL reflection leads us to conclude that these distinctions can no longer be claimed for language for the precise reason that there can be no expression without indication, no signified without the signifier, no meaning or sense without the factually constituted complex of signifiers. To conclude that expression can never be reduced to an absolutely objective core of meaning, to conclude that meaning itself is no longer conceivable as a purely ideal presence, is also to conclude, for Derrida, that a certain period of metaphysical thought has come to a close. The most difficult task of any translator is to establish some effective compromise between transposition and transformation. However much one wishes to avoid altering the original style and vocabulary, they must inevitably succumb to modification and paraphrase, at least to some extent. In the present case this has been particularly true of such elements as sentence complexity and length. Yet, perhaps the greatest attention must be given to Derrida's terminology, which is sometimes at odds with English usage. I have tried to avoid his Latinate vocabulary, save for some few exceptions. One of these is the term aldeirite, which arises in his discussion of difference. Like its French equivalent, aldeirite, the term is rich in connotations, to alter, to alternate, alternation, alternative, alteration, alter ego, etc., and it has fewer ethical or personal overtones than other possible translations, such as otherness. Similar ambiguities are also avoided by translating auto-affection, not as self-affection or self-reference, but as the more extensive, for phoneme not the actually uttered sound complex itself. The silent speech stands as a pure phenomenon, what Derrida terms the phenomenological voice. The importance of the voice is not fortuitous with Husserl. Implicitly or explicitly, the vocal medium has always functioned as the highest, the purest, form of signification. Its primacy is also that of reason and thought. How this complicity operates for Husserl and the tradition is one of the major themes of the present work. For Derrida, however, the primacy of speech, which is ultimately the primacy of presence, is illusory. It seems primary because it takes place in an instant, in the apparent absence of the world. But in reality, speech is possible only because a certain kind of writing precedes it, the invisible and unconscious inscription of traces, the non-present and generative movement of difference that constitutes the system of language itself. Translator's introduction / it applies to the processes or events of temporality, spacing, difference, etc., and not to an already constituted personality, auto-affection in general. Derrida takes the term in its Heideggerian sense. There are cases, however, where ethical or axiological connotations are meant to be retained, as with the term transgression. In attempting to break down the precepts and rules of Western logocentric and phonocentric thought, and by trying to bring its system to a close, one quite literally violates it. And when this order has been identified as the onto-theological ground of metaphysics, then the violation would surely constitute a transgression in the strictest sense. Among other Heideggerian terms, Derrida occasionally uses the word errance. This is the accepted French translation of Heidegger's dire, a term which appears frequently throughout his work, especially in Was ist Metaphysik, and Vom Wessender Wahrheit. Richardson first introduced the term into English as errance, and he gives an admirable justification for it, noting that it incorporates not only the sense of error but also that of aberrance, i.e., of being off course, wandering away from the truth. 6 Where Derrida introduces neologisms, such as difference, I have added explanatory footnotes or have made reference to his own discussion of the term. For Derrida's extensive quotations from Husserl, I have used existing English translations. Occasionally it has been necessary to modify these where the change was demanded by Derrida's own argument, example in order to stress the etymology, or evocative import, of a particular term. In making these modifications, I have found Dorian Cairns's guide for translating Husserl extremely helpful and instructive. In the course of preparing this translation, I have become deeply indebted to Professor Derrida himself, who, in the course of several long discussions, offered great encouragement as well as assistance with the text. My sincerest thanks must also be given to Professors Hubert Dreyfus and Newton Garber for their care and erudition in going over the manuscript, and to Virginia Seidman for the patience and intelligence she devoted to the labor. 6. See William J. Richardson, Heidegger, Through Phenomenology to Thought, 2d ed. Phenomenologica 13, The Hague, Nijhoff, 1967, p. 224. Sly of editing it. I would especially like to express my debt of gratitude and appreciation to Alfonso Lingus, whose suggestions and knowledgeable criticism were invaluable to me at every stage. David B. Allison, Stony Brook, New York, September 1972. Speech and Phenomena, Introduction to the Problem of Signs in Husserl's Phenomenology. When we read this word T without knowing who wrote it, it is perhaps not meaningless, but is at least estranged from its normal meaning. Logical Investigations. A name on being mentioned reminds us of the Dresden Gallery and of our last visit there. We wander through the rooms and stop in front of a painting by Teniers which represents a gallery of paintings. Let us further suppose that the paintings of this gallery would represent in their turn paintings, which, on their part, exhibited readable inscriptions and so forth. Ideas. I have spoken both of sound and voice. I mean to say that the sound was one of distinct, of even wonderfully, thrillingly distinct, syllabification. M. Valdemar spoke, obviously in reply to the question. He now said, yes, no, I have been sleeping and now I am dead. The facts in the case of M. Valdemar. Introduction. The Logical Investigations, 1900 to 1901, opened a path which, as we know, the whole of phenomenology has followed. Up to the 4th edition, 1928, there was no fundamental change, no determined re-examination. Some touching up, certainly, and a powerful work of explication. Ideas. Informal and transcendental logic develop without break the concepts of intentional or noematic sense, the difference between the two strata of analytics in the strong sense, the pure forms of judgments and consequence logic, and suppress the deductivist or nomological form which had hitherto limited his concept of science in general. 1 In the crisis and texts of the same period, particularly in the origin of geometry, the conceptual premises of the investigations are still at work, notably when they concern all the problems of signification and language in general. In this area more than elsewhere, a patient reading of the investigations would show the germinal structure of the whole of Husserl's thought. On each page the necessity or the implicit practice of synthetic and phenomenological reductions is visible, and the presence of everything to which they will give access is already discernible. But the first of the investigations, Expression and Meanly, Edmund Husserl, Formale und Transcendental Logic, Halle, Max Niemeyer, 1929, 35b. English translation by Dorian Cairns, Formal and Transcendental Logic, The Hague, Martinus Nijhoff F. X 969, p. 102. English translations will be referred to throughout as et. For general information about my use of English translations of Husserl, SEC My Translator's Introduction. Translator. 3-4 2 opens with a chapter devoted to some essential distinctions which rigorously command all the subsequent analyses. And the coherence of this chapter is entirely due to a distinction proposed in the first paragraph. The word sign, Zetchen, will have a twofold sense. Ein Doppelsinn, sign may signify expression, Ausdruck, or indication, and Zetchen. In terms of what question are we to accept and read this apparently so portentous distinction? Before proposing this purely phenomenologic distinction between the two senses of the word sign, or rather, even before recognizing it, before setting it off in what purports to be a simple description, Husserl proceeds to what is in effect a phenomenological reduction. He puts out of play all constituted knowledge. He insists on the necessary absence of presuppositions, Voraussetzungslosigkeit, whether they come from metaphysics, psychology, or the natural sciences. The point of departure in the factum of language is not a presupposition, provided that one is attentive to the contingency of the example. Analyses thus directed keep their sense and their epistemological value, their import for the theory of knowledge, erkenntnis theoretisken word, whether or not there exist any languages, whether being such as men use them effectively or not, whether men or nature really exist, or exist only in the imagination and according to the mode of possibility. We have thus a prescription for the most general form of our question, do not phenomenological necessity, the rigor and subtlety of Husserl's analysis, the exigencies to which it responds and which we must first recognize, nonetheless conceal a metaphysical presupposition? Do they not harbor a dogmatic or speculative commitment which, to be sure, would not keep the phenomenological critique from being realized, would not too? With the exception of several overtures or indispensable anticipations, the present essay analyzes the doctrine of signification as it is formed in the first of the logical investigations. In order to better follow the difficult and tortuous itinerary, we have generally abstained from comparisons, reconciliations, or oppositions which seem to impose themselves, here or there, between Husserl's phenomenology and other theories, classical or modern, of signification. Each time that we go beyond the text of the first logical investigation, it is to indicate the principle of a general interpretation of Husserl's thought and to sketch that systematic reading which we hope to try one day. Introduction/5 be a residue of unperceived naivete, but would constitute phenomenology from within, in its project of criticism and in the instructive value of its own premises. This would be done precisely in what soon comes to be recognized as the source and guarantee of all value, the principle of principles, i.e., the original self-giving evidence, the present, or presence of sense to a full and primordial intuition. In other words, we shall not be asking whether such and such metaphysical heritage has been able, here or there, to restrict the vigilance of the phenomenologist, but whether the phenomenological form of this vigilance is not already controlled by metaphysics itself. In the few lines just touched upon, distrust of metaphysical presuppositions is already presented as the condition for an authentic theory of knowledge / as if the project of a theory of knowledge, even when it has freed itself by the critique of such and such speculative system, did not belong at the outset to the history of metaphysics. Is not the idea of knowledge and of the theory of knowledge in itself metaphysical? What is at issue, then, in the privileged example of the concept of sign, is to see the phenomenological critique of metaphysics betray itself as a moment within the history of metaphysical assurance. Better still, our intention is to begin to confirm that the recourse to phenomenological critique is metaphysics itself, restored to its original purity in its historical achievement. We have tried elsewhere as to follow the movement by which Husserl, while ceaselessly criticizing metaphysical speculation, in fact had his eye on only the perversion or the degeneracy of what he continued to believe in and wished to restore as authentic metaphysics or philosophia prots. Concluding his Cartesian meditations, Husserl again opposes authentic metaphysics, which will owe its accomplishment to phenomenology, to metaphysics in the customary sense. The results which he presents there are, he says, metaphysical, if it be true that ultimate cognitions of being should be called metaphysical. On the other hand, what we have here is anything but metaphysics in the customary sense, a historically degenerate metaphysics, which by no means conforms to the sense with which metaphysics, as first philosophy, was instituted origine 3. La Phenom and Iology et la Cloture de la Métaphysique, Ajaxes, Athens, February, 1966. 6 Nally. Phenomenology's purely intuitive, concrete, and also apodictic mode of demonstration excludes all metaphysical adventure, all speculative excesses. Cartesian Meditations, 60, et. p. 139, for the unique and permanent motif of all the mistakes and distortions which Husserl exposes in degenerated metaphysics, across a multiplicity of domains, themes, and arguments, is always a blindness to the authentic mode of ideality, to that which is, to what may be indefinitely repeated in the identity of its presence, because of the very fact that it does not exist, is not real or is irreal not in the sense of being a fiction, but in another sense which may have several names, whose possibility will permit us to speak of non-reality and essential necessity, the noema, the intelligible object, and in general the non-worldly. This non-worldliness is not another worldliness, this ideality is not an existent that has fallen from the sky, its origin will always be the possible repetition of a productive act. In order that the possibility of this repetition may be open, ideally to infinity, one ideal form must assure this unity of the indefinite and the ideal, this is the present, or rather the presence of the living present. The ultimate form of ideality, the ideality of ideality, that in which in the last instance one may anticipate or recall all repetition, is the living present, the self-presence of transcendental life. Presence has always been and will always, forever, be the form in which, we can say apodictically, the infinite diversity of contents is produced. The opposition between form and matter which inaugurates metaphysics finds in the concrete ideality of the living present its ultimate and radical justification. We will come back to the enigma of the concept of life in such expressions as living present and transcendental life. Let us note only, in order to here specify our intention, that phenomenology seems to us tormented, if not contested from within, by its own descriptions of the movement of temporalization and of the constitution of intersubjectivity. At the heart of what ties together these two decisive moments of description we recognize an irreducible non-presence as having a constituting value. 4. Edmund Husserl, Cartesianist Meditation and UND Pariser Vortrage, Husserliana 1, The Hague, Marty Neusnijhoff, 1950. English translation by Dorian Cairns, Cartesian Meditations, The Hague, Marty Neusnijhoff, I-960. Introduction/7 and with it a non-life, a non-presence or non-self belonging of the living present, an ineradicable non-primordiality. The names which it assumes only render more palpable the resistance to the form of presence. Briefly, it is a question of 1. The necessary transition from retention to representation, Verständigung, in the constitution of the presence of a temporal object, Gegenstand, whose identity may be repeated, and 2. The necessary transition by way of a presentation in relation to the alter ego, that is, in relation to what also makes possible an ideal objectivity in general, for intersubjectivity is the condition for objectivity, which is absolute only in the case of ideal objects. What in the two cases is called a modification of presentation, representation, AP presentation, Verständigung or a presentation, is not something that happens to presentation but rather conditions it by bifurcating it a priori. This does not impugn the apodicticity of the phenomenological transcendental description, nor does it diminish the founding value of presence. Besides, founding value of presence is a pleonastic expression. It is only a question of bringing out that the lack of foundation is basic and non-empirical and that the security of presence in the metaphorical form of ideality arises and is set forth again upon this irreducible void. It is within this compass that we will now question the phenomenological concept of the sign. The concept of metaphysics with which we shall be operating will have to be made precise and the excessive generality of this question narrowed. First, how can we justify the decision which subordinates a reflection on the sign to a logic? And if the concept of sign precedes logical reflection, is given to it, and is free from its critique, from whence does it come? Where does the essence of the sign, according to which the concept is regulated, come from? What gives a theory of knowledge the authority to determine the essence and origin of language? We do not impute such a decision to Husserl, he explicitly assumes it, or rather he explicitly assumes its tradition and its validity. The consequences of this are limitless. On the one hand, Husserl had to postpone, from one end of his itinerary to the other, all explicit meditation on the essence of language in general. He still puts it out of play in the formal and transcendental logic, preliminary considerations, too. And, as Fink has well shown, Husserl never raised the question of the transcendental logos, the inherited innate gauge in which phenomenology produces and exhibits the results of its reductive operations. The unity of ordinary language, or the language of traditional metaphysics, and the language of phenomenology is never broken in spite of the precautions, the brackets, the renovations or innovations. Transforming a traditional concept into an indicative or metaphorical concept does not eliminate its heritage, it imposes questions, rather, to which Husserl never ventured a response. This is due to the fact that, on the other hand, being interested in language only within the compass of rationality, determining the logos from logic, Husserl had, in a most traditional manner, determined the essence of language by taking the logical as its telos or norm. That this telos is that of being as presence is what we here wish to suggest. Thus, for example, when Husserl redefines the relation between the purely grammatical and the purely logical, a relation which traditional logic would have lacked, distorted as it was by metaphysical presuppositions, when he institutes a pure morphology of Bedeutungen, we do not translate this word for reasons which will appear in a moment, to explain the purely grammatical. What results is that the generality of this meta-empirical grammar is not sufficient to cover the whole field of possibility for language in general, it does not exhaust the whole extension of languages a priori. When we speak of the purely grammatical, we mean that system of rules which enables us to recognize whether or not a discourse is, properly speaking, a discourse. Speech, to be sure, must make sense, but do falsity and the absurdity of contradiction, wider synecite, necessarily make it unintelligible? Do they necessarily deprive discourse of its experienced and intelligible character, thereby rendering it sinless? This grammar concerns only the logical a priori of language, it is pure logical grammar. This restriction is operative from the beginning, although Husserl does not insist on it in the first edition of the Investigations. In the first edition I spoke of pure grammar, a name conceived and expressly devised to be analogous to Kant's pure science of nature. Since it cannot, however, be said that pure formal semantic, Bedeutungen, theory comprehends the entire a priori of general grammar, there is, example, a peculiar a priori governing relations of mutual understanding among minded persons, relations introduction/9 very important for grammar talk of pure logical grammar is to be preferred. Point 5 The delineation of the logical a priori within the general a priori of language does not set apart a region, rather it designates, as we shall see, the dignity of a telos, the purity of a norm, and the essence of a destination. That this gesture, whereby the whole of phenomenology is already involved, repeats the original intention of metaphysics itself is what we wish to show here by pointing out in the first of the Investigations those roots which will remain undisturbed by Husserl's subsequent discourse. The factor of presence, the ultimate court of appeal for the whole of this discourse, is itself modified, without being lost, each time there is a question of the presence, in the two related senses, of the proximity of what is set forth as an object of an intuition, and the proximity of the temporal present which gives the clear and present intuition of the object its form, of any object whatever to consciousness, in the clear evidence of a fulfilled intuition. Indeed, the element of presence is modified whenever it is a question of self-presence in consciousness, where consciousness means nothing other than the possibility of the self-presence of the present in the living present. Every time this element of presence becomes threatened, Husserl will awaken it, recall it, and bring it back to itself in the form of a telos, that is, an idea in the Kantian sense. There is no ideality without there being an idea in the Kantian sense at work, opening up the possibility of something indefinite, the infinity of a stipulated progression or the infinity of permissible repetitions. This ideality is the very form in which the presence of an object in general may be indefinitely repeated as the same. The non-reality of the Bedeutung, the non-reality of the ideal object, the non-reality of the inclusion of sense or noema in consciousness, Husserl will say that the noema does not really belong to consciousness, will thus give the assurance that presence to consciousness can be indefinitely repeated, ideal presence to an ideal or transcendental consciousness. Ideality is the preservation or mastery of presence. 5. Edmund Husserl, Logisk Untersuchungen, 1st ed., 2 volumes, Halle, Max Niemeyer, 1900, 2d ed., 1913. English translation by J. N. Findlay, Logical Investigations, 2 volumes, New York, Humanities Press, 1970, 2, 5*710 in repetition. In its pure form, this presence is the presence of nothing existing in the world, it is a correlation with the acts of repetition, themselves ideal. Is this to say that what opens the repetition to the infinite, or what is opened up when the movement of idealization is assured, is a certain relation of an existent to his death? And that the transcendental life is the scene of this relationship? It is too soon to tell. First we must deal with the problem of language. No one will be surprised if we say that language is properly the medium for this play of presence and absence. Is there not within language, is it not language itself that might seem to unify life and ideality? But we ought to consider, on the one hand, that the element of signification or the substance of expression which best seems to preserve ideality and living presence in all its forms is living speech, the spirituality of the breath as phone, and, on the other hand, that phenomenology, the metaphysics of presence in the form of ideality, is also a philosophy of life. It is a philosophy of life, not only because at its center death is recognized as but an empirical and extrinsic signification, a worldly accident, but because the source of sense in general is always determined as the act of living, as the act of a living being, as Lebendigkeit. But the unity of living, the focus of Lebendigkeit which diffracts its light in all the fundamental concepts of phenomenology, Leben, or Levnis, Lebendige Gegenwart, Geistigkeit, etc., escapes the transcendental reduction and, as unity of worldly life, even opens up the way for it. When the empirical life, or even the region of the purely psychic, is bracketed, it is still a transcendental life or, in the final instance, the transcendentality of a living present that Husserl uncovers. And yet he thematised the concept of life without as much as raising the question of its unity. The soulless, seelenloses, consciousness, whose essential possibility is redeemed in ideas I, 54, is still a living transcendental consciousness. If we concluded, with a very Husserlian gesture, that the concepts of empirical, or in general, worldly, life and transcendental life are radically heterogeneous and that the two names sustain a simply indicative or metaphorical relation between themselves, then it is upon the possibility of this relation that the whole weight of the question falls. The common root that makes all these metaphors possible still introduction/11 seems to us to be the concept of life. There is, in the final instance, says Husserl, a relation of parallelism between the purely mental the region of the world opposed to transcendental consciousness and discovered by the reduction of the totality of the natural and transcendent world and pure transcendental life. Phenomenological psychology will have to continue to call upon psychology to work over its fund of eidetic presuppositions and the conditions for its own language. It has the task of fixing the sense of concepts derived from psychology, and first of all the sense of what is called the psyche. But what will distinguish this phenomenological psychology, this descriptive science, eidetic and a priori, from transcendental phenomenology itself? What will distinguish the epoche which discloses the immanent domain of the purely psychic from the transcendental epoche itself? For the field opened up by this pure psychology has a privilege with respect to all other regions, and its generality dominates all others. Its domain necessarily includes all lived experiences, and the sense of every determinate region or object is Bedoken through it. Also, the dependence of the purely psychic upon the transcendental consciousness, as proto-orgain, is quite singular. For the domain of pure psychological experience incorporates the total domain of what Husserl calls transcendental experience. Yet despite this perfect incorporation, a radical difference remains, one having nothing in common with any other difference, a difference in fact distinguishing nothing, a difference separating no state, no experience, no determined signification but a difference which, without altering anything, changes all the signs, and in which alone the possibility of a transcendental question is contained. That is to say, freedom itself. A fundamental difference, thus, without which no other difference in the world would either make any sense or have the chance to appear as such. Without the possibility and the recognition of such a duplication, Verdoppelung, whose rigor tolerates no duplicity, without this invisible distance held out between the two acts of the epoche, transcendental phenomenology would be destroyed in its root. The difficulty lies in that this duplication of sense must correspond to no ontological double. Husserl specifies, for example, that my transcendental ego is radically different from 12 my natural and human ego, 6 and yet it is distinguished by nothing, nothing that can be determined in the natural sense of distinction. The transcendental ego is not an other. It is certainly not the formal or metaphysical phantom of the empirical ego. Indeed this leads us to take the ego as absolute spectator of its own psychic self to be but a theoretical image and metaphor. We would also expose the analogical character of language which must sometimes be used to announce the transcendental reduction as well as to describe that unusual object, the psychic self as it confronts the absolute transcendental self. In fact no language can cope with the operation by which the transcendental ego constitutes and opposes itself to its worldly self, its soul, reflecting itself in a WR Welt-like and Selbstperception. 7 The pure soul is the strange self-objectification, Selbstabjektivierung, of the monad in and by itself. 8 Here, too, the soul originates in the one, monadic ego, and may be freely turned toward it in a reduction. All these difficulties are concentrated in the enigmatic concept of parallelism. Husserl evokes 9 the surprising parallelism and even, if one may say, incorporation of phenomenological psychology and transcendental phenomenology, both of them understood as eidetic disciplines. The one inhabits the other, as it were, implicitly. This nothing that distinguishes the parallels, this nothing without which precisely no explication, that is, no language, could be freely developed in the service of truth without being deformed by some reed contact, this nothing without which no transcendental, that is, philosophical, question could be opened, this nothing arises, so to speak, when the totality of the world is neutralized in its existence and is reduced to its phenomenal being. This operation is that of the transcendental reduction, it may in no case be that of the psychophenomenological reduction. The pure eidetic of psychic experience doubtless concerns no determined existence, no matter of empirical fact, it makes no appeal to any signification transcendent to consciousness. But the essences it fixes intrinsically. 6. Edmund Husserl, Phenomenologisch Psychologie, Lectures delivered in the summer semester, 1925, ed. Walter Biemel, Husserlana 9, The Hague, Marty Neusnichhoff, 1962, p. 342. 7 Cartesian Meditations, 45. 8 Ibid, 57. 9 Phenomenologisch Psychologie, p. 343. Introduction/13 presuppose the existence of the world in the form of that worldly region called psyche. Moreover, we must notice that this parallelism does more than release transcendental ether, it renders more mysterious still, as it alone is capable of doing, the meaning of the mental and of mental life, that is, of a worldliness capable of sustaining, or in some way nourishing, transcendentality, and of equaling the full scope of its domain, yet without being merged with it in some total adequation. To conclude that this parallelism is an adequation is the most tempting, the most subtle, but also the most obscuring of confusions, transcendental psychologism. Against it we must maintain the precarious and fragile distance between the parallels, against it we must ceaselessly direct our questions. But since the meaning of the transcendental consciousness is not affected by the hypothesis of the destruction of the world, ideas 49, certainly an incorporeal and, paradoxical as it may sound, even an inanimate, seelenloses, and non-personal consciousness is conceivable, Ibid 954, et. p. 167.10 Moreover, the transcendental consciousness is nothing more and nothing other than the psychological consciousness. Transcendental psychologism misunderstands this. If the world needs the supplement of a soul, the soul, which is in the world, needs this supplementary nothing which is the transcendental and without which no world would appear. But, on the other hand, we must, if we are to be attentive to Husserl's renewal of the notion of transcendental, refrain from attributing any reality to this distance, substantializing this non-consistency or making it be, even merely analogically, something or some moment of the world. This would be to extinguish the light at its source. If language never escapes analogy, if it is indeed analogy through and through, it ought, having arrived at this point, at this stage, freely to assume its own destruction and cast metaphor against metaphor, all of which amounts to complying with the most traditional of imperatives, something which has received its most explicit but not most original form in the Enneads and has ceaselessly 10. Edmund Husserl, Die Einzelheiten und Phenomenologie und die Phenomenologische Philosophie, Husserliana 3, The Hague, Martinus Nijhoff, 1913. English translation by W. R. Boyce Gibson, Ideas, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, New York, Humanities Press, 1930, p. 167. 14 and faithfully been transmitted right up to the Introduction to Metaphysics, especially by Bergson. It is at the price of this war of language against itself that the sense and question of its origin will be thinkable. This war is obviously not one war among others. A polemic for the possibility of sense and world, it takes place in this difference, which, we have seen, cannot reside in the world but only in language, in the transcendental disquietude of language. Indeed, far from only living in language, this war is also the origin and residence of language. Language preserves the difference that preserves language. Later, in his Knockwords Zeomenadain/11 and in the Cartesian Meditations, 14 and 57, Husserl will again briefly invoke this precise parallel between the pure psychology of consciousness and the transcendental phenomenology of consciousness. And in order to deny that transcendental psychologism which makes a genuine philosophy impossible, Cartesian Meditations, 14, he will then say that at all costs we shall have to practice the Nuancierung, Knockword, p. 557, which distinguishes the parallels, one of which is in the world and the other outside the world without being in another world, that is, without ceasing to be, like every parallel, alongside, right next to the other. We must stringently assemble and protect in our discourse these frivolous, subtle, seemingly trivial nuances which make a decisive difference between right and wrong paths, of philosophy, Cartesian Meditations, 14. Our discussion ought to incorporate these protected nuances and thereby at the same time consolidate in them its own possibility and rigor. But the strange unity of these two parallels, that which refers the one to the other, does not allow itself to be sundered by them and, by dividing itself, finally joins the transcendental to its other. This unity is life. One finds out quickly enough that the sole nucleus of the concept of psyche is life as self-relationship, whether or not it takes place in the form of consciousness. Living is thus the name of that which precedes the reduction and finally 11. Knockwords Zeomenadain Zeoinerainen Phenomenology und Phenomenologisch Philosophic / Jahrbuch für Philosophie und Phenomenologisch 1st Chung, 11, Halley, 1930, * 549-7 degree. The Knockword, translated by Boyce Gibson, appears as the preface to the English edition of Ideas. Introduction / 15 escapes all the divisions which the latter gives rise to. But this is precisely because it is its own division and its own opposition to its other. In determining living in this way, we come to designate the origin of the insecurity of discourse, precisely the point where it can no longer assure its possibility and rigor within the nuance. This concept of life is then grasped in an instance which is no longer that of pre-transcendental naivete, the language of day-to-day life or biological science. But if this ultra-transcendental concept of life enables us to conceive life, in the ordinary or the biological sense, and if it has never been inscribed in language, it requires another name. We will be less astonished before this oblique and laborious, tenacious endeavor of phenomenology to protect the spoken word, to affirm an essential tie between logos and phne, when we remember that consciousness owes its privileged status, about which Husserl in the end never asked what it was, in spite of the admirable, interminable, and in so many respects revolutionary, meditation he devoted to it, to the possibility of a living vocal medium la voix. Since self-consciousness appears only in its relation to an object, whose presence it can keep and repeat, it is never perfectly foreign or anterior to the possibility of language. Husserl no doubt did want to maintain, as we shall see, an originally silent, pre-expressive stratum of experience. But since the possibility of constituting ideal objects belongs to the essence of consciousness, and since these ideal objects are historical products, only appearing thanks to acts of creation or intending, the element of consciousness and the element of language will be more and more difficult to discern. Will not their indiscernibility introduce non-presence and difference, mediation, signs, referral back, etc., in the heart of self-presence? This difficulty calls for a response. This response is the voice la voix. The voice is richly and profoundly enigmatic in all that it here seems to answer. That the voice simulates the conservation of presence, and that the history of spoken language is the archives of the simulation, this at once prevents us from considering the difficulty to which, in Husserl's phenomenology, the voice answers as a difficulty of the system or a contradiction proper to it. This prevents us also from describing the simulation, whose structure is of an infinite complexity, as an illustration, phantasm, or hallucination. These last concepts, on the contrary, refer to the simulation of language as well as to their common root. It remains that this difficulty structures the whole of Husserl's discourse and that we ought to recognize the work involved therein. Husserl will radicalize the necessary privilege of the von Euro 9 which is implied by the whole history of metaphysics, and exploit all its resources with the greatest critical refinement. For it is not in the sonorous substance or in the physical voice, in the body of speech in the world, that he will recognize an original affinity with the logos in general, but in the voice phenomenologically taken, speech in its transcendental flesh, in the breath, the intentional animation that transforms the body of the word into flesh, makes of the corpora alive, a geistige Leiblichkeit. The phenomenological voice would be the spiritual flesh that continues to speak and be present to itself to hear itself in the absence of the world. Of course, what one accords to the voice is accorded to the language of words, a language constituted of unities which one might have believed irreducible, which cannot be broken down joining the signified concept to the signifying phonic complex. Despite the vigilance of the description, a perhaps naive treatment of the concept of word has doubtless left unresolved the tension of the two major motifs in phenomenology, the purity of formalism and the radically of intuitionism. That the privilege of presence as consciousness can be established, that is, historically constituted and demonstrated only by virtue of the excellence of the voice, is a truism which has never occupied the forefront of the phenomenological stage. In a mode neither simply operative nor directly thematic, in a place neither central nor peripheral, the necessity of this truism seems to have assured itself a sort of hold throughout phenomenology. The nature of this hold is poorly conceived in the concepts habitually sanctioned in the philosophy of the history of philosophy. But our purpose here is not directly to meditate upon the form of this hold but only to show it already and powerfully at work from the start, in the first of the logical investigations.